You actually tossed me a softball there, Tammy. There are so many resonances between what you just talked about and what I'm going to try to talk about now. And perhaps that's not surprising given that we've lived in the same intellectual and spiritual community for quite a while now. So Josh Lewis, if you wouldn't mind just putting in the chat box the link to my sources, which if you can click on and you can follow along the sources when we get to them. If you choose not to, I'm going to read the important pieces aloud anyway. So you can kind of follow along with them yourself, or you can just listen. So I probably, like a lot of you, during this pandemic and the lockdown with which it started, I found myself reading a lot. And I tried to think a little bit about why I was so invested in reading, beyond the obvious point that I had more time than I always like to read. It seemed like an inadequate explanation to me because the intensity with which I found myself searching for something in what I was reading, just it went beyond a simple, well, I have more time. And I came up with this, which is that I think anyone who's ever been really struck by a work of literature felt that power when a story or a poem, when it suddenly speaks to you and seems to express something that you've always thought or felt but never said aloud. And anyone who's ever felt befriended by a poem, and I like that word, befriended by a poem, at a crucial moment of your life, you can imagine maybe that this was a good time to read. It was a good time to do something that made me feel understood and maybe consequently a little bit less alone. So I have an introduction, but I first have an introduction to the introduction. So the title I gave this talk came from King Lear. Maybe some of you recognized it, which is really an appropriate text to think about during the pandemic. And my comments about this play will be almost entirely and unapologetically personal. I'm not an academic, and I'm going to argue that King Lear is relevant to my experience of the last few months from a thematic perspective. But it's also, on the most practical level, a pretty relevant text. Rabbi Kroll, a few months back, drew my attention to an article in the New York Times that pointed out that Shakespeare might have been working on King Lear during the plague outbreak of the summer of 1606. Given that the tragedy's first performance was at the Palace of Whitehall, the main London residence of Tudor and Stuart English monarchs, and the play was first performed on St. Stephen's Night during the Christmas season of that same year, it makes sense that he would have been working on it the previous summer during that plague outbreak. The impact of the plague, of this disease on the play, though, is less than overt. There are references to the plague that sort of slide by modern readers. They're noteworthy mostly because of their casual cruelty, but not so much for their plague resonance. But they must have struck readers and people that were watching the play at the time in a much more forceful fashion. Like when Lear curses his daughter Regan and her husband Cornwall with vengeance, plague, death, confusion, and he berates her as a plague sore or embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood. Right? That would have really struck a chord for them, living through the plague a few months after the outbreak had subsided. So this New York Times article inspired me to do a little bit more research, and I found this wonderful paragraph written by Andrew Dixon, a British cultural critic and journalist. And I love this paragraph. He writes, "While those of us stuck in self-isolation or working from home watch TikTok videos and refresh live blogs, a meme has been going around that claims Shakespeare made use of being quarantined during the plague to write King Lear. The bard supposedly took advantage of the Globe's lengthy closure to get on top of his writing inbox, coming up with Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra to boot. If you weren't panicky enough about how little you've achieved recently, this is surely a way to feel worse. Why aren't you finally dusting off that novel or screenplay you've been itching to write? It's what the bard would do." So it makes me think a little bit about those reminders. Maybe you get these that pop up on my iPhone about how my screen time has increased each week, so guilt-inducing. And the question is it actually true? Did he write this play during the plague? And the answer is maybe. We know that it was first performed in that winter of 1606. It makes sense that he would have been writing it during this plague season that summer, which did rage through the city of London, apparently raged through the parish where Shakespeare lived. And we know his house was affected. One of the people that died that year was his landlady, a woman whose name I will now, with great embarrassment, mispronounce, Marie Mountjoy. When you know this, it gets harder not to hear pandemic echoes in Lear. And we are now more than ever familiar with what the mood in the city of London would have been like during those times. Deserted streets and closed shops, dogs running free. carers carrying 3-foot staves painted red so everybody else would know, keep your distance from the medical workers. Church bells endlessly tolling for funerals, like the ambulance sirens we grew too used to hearing these past months. And in the world of the play, images of death and chaos and nihilism and desperation, as Gloucester, who's one of the few characters to remain loyal to King Lear, as King Lear loses everything, Gloucester observes, love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide, in palaces treason, and the bond cracked twixt son and father. We have seen the best of our time. It's not a stretch to read the various relational fractures that Gloucester is here describing in the context of quarantine families and their associated strains. But I didn't invite you here so that I could be a Debbie Downer. So those of you that have not yet fled this Zoom in search of more cheerful ways to spend the evening, take heart. Because despite this layer to King Lear, I believe that in a subtle sense, it is the most optimistic of Shakespeare's tragedies. King Lear starts with King Lear wanting to retire as king, and he decides to divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters, and the daughter that is best able to prove to him that she loves him will get the largest share of the kingdom. That's how the play starts. So the play starts then, Lear is a terrible king, selfish, unself-aware, making this a terrible way to decide who gets to run your kingdom. He's selfish and unself-aware. He makes terrible decisions on behalf of England for the most narcissistic of reasons. He's a terrible leader. And as the play progresses, right, what ends up happening is his youngest and most beloved daughter, Cordelia, she says that she can't put into words what she feels for him. He's going to have to take it on faith. Meanwhile, the other 2 daughters, Goneril and Regan, they go overboard to tell him how much they love him. So who inherits the kingdom? Naturally, a vain, narcissistic king gives the kingdom over to the other 2 daughters and banishes Cordelia. Those 2 daughters, in fact, didn't really love him as much as they said they loved him. Turns out that saying you love someone isn't the same as loving someone. So as the play progresses, he loses his kingdom, his home, his family, ultimately his sense of self. He first becomes aware of what a bad king he was. Then he becomes aware of what a bad father he was. So yes, he dies at the end, and he's heartbroken because he watches his daughter's murder. And that it is a tragedy after all. And as the Duke of Albany observes, it's a sad time whose weight we must obey, presumably by mourning appropriately. But before he dies, he has a beautiful redemptive moment with his youngest daughter, Cordelia, the only loyal, truly loving daughter, in which he both begs forgiveness from her and embraces what time he has left. He embraces, accepts his fate willingly, as long, he says, as he has her by his side. There is growth here. There is real change. A man stripped of everything, ultimately imprisoned, who learns to live more fully and honestly and ethically. And the play does conclude that the world is a dark place. But it also suggests that there is redemption possible and that trapped as we are, we can live meaningful for as much or as little time as we have. So we're going to talk about King Lear tonight. And that was the intro to the intro. And now the intro. And there's 2 texts on your source sheets. If you want to look at them, I'll also read the relevant parts out loud that I want to use as a kind of thematic backdrop. Those are the first 2 sources. The first is from Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, psychiatrist, wrote an amazing book called Man's Search for Meaning. She tries to describe the psychopathology of the concentration camp victim and survivor. And he writes, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you become the plaything to circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity. For Viktor Frankl, freedom is not about the external circumstances in which we find ourselves, but the spirit with which we respond to those circumstances. And he has a kind of kal vachomer in his argument. Concentration camps, he thinks, were the perfect place to realize this value, because if it's true in Auschwitz that we can see that human freedom playing out, then it has to be true everywhere else as well. And another source from David James Duncan, who's a wonderful Christian theologian that I've been reading in the last couple of weeks. And he writes, philosophically speaking, wonder is crucial to finding knowledge, yet has everything to do with ignorance. Only an admission of ignorance can open us to fresh knowing. Wonder is the experience of that admission. And I italicize this next part because I love it. Wonder is unknowing experienced as pleasure. Wonder is a period at the end of a statement we've long taken for granted, suddenly looking up and seeing the sinuous curve of a tall black hat on its head and realizing it was a question mark all along. So I gave you more to that source there. And what that source kind of reminds me of, what it makes me think about, is our capacity for wonder and how important that's been to me in the last few months. And during the pandemic, probably I, like a lot of you, have tried to pay attention to certain things in my life. Literature has helped me, directed my attention toward them. And King Lear has, in particular, directed my attention to 3 arenas of human experience. And I want to touch on all 3 tonight: community, family, and nature. To use King Lear to briefly talk about these 3 categories. So the first, community. So I mentioned that Lear grows a lot over the course of this play, or I think he grows a lot. At the beginning of this play, he only wants his daughters to tell him how much they love him and how great he is. He's less concerned with love. He's more concerned with the appearance of love, or maybe better said, the performance of love. He wants to be praised. He wants his daughters and subjects to tell him what a great father and king he was, to express their undying devotion. He cares nothing for the needs of his kingdom. Not once does he say, who's the best daughter to rule England? He is all vanity and narcissism. And he soon learns that he mistook his 2 older daughters' professions of love for actual love. They become increasingly hostile to him. He rejects their hospitality. I'll put that in air quotes because they're not particularly hospitable to him. And he ends up wandering the English countryside during a storm of almost magical proportions. A storm that the play makes clear is unlike any storm England has ever experienced. He's exposed to the elements. He's in danger of losing his life. And the first thing he does is rail against the storm. He literally contests with nature. He challenges the storm to destroy everything in England. Another monumental moment of self-righteous rage and narcissism and self-centeredness. After all, his misery does not need to become universal. Most of us don't feel that our misery, that everyone needs to experience, but he feels that way. Until eventually he encounters a few other ragged, impoverished wanderers outside of a hovel. And there's more to these wanderers, but if you want to know more about them, you can read the play, if you haven't already. And he's struck by the vulnerability of these wanderers, how poor they are. Seemingly for the first time in his life, he recognizes how vulnerable poor people are. And he offers the following commentary on his failure as a king to take care of these English citizens. And this is on your source sheet if you prefer to read it for yourselves and not just listen. He says, "Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm. How shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have taken too little care of this." It's an amazing moment. He is so different from the Lear who thought nothing of the ramifications of dividing his kingdom based on his daughter's professions of love for him. Even from who he was when the storm began, the complete lack of sympathy he shows at the beginning of the storm for the citizens of the country that he led, when he shouts at the storm and commands it to level the kingdom. He's learned something about himself and about the importance of caring for others. His loss has engendered growth. His crisis has directed his attention to the misery he ignored for so long, and he begins to imagine what he might do to relieve the suffering of others. His suffering leads him to a greater awareness of the community of which he was always a part, and his responsibility to care for the other members of that community. If you read the end of that speech, which you have in your source sheet, he's actually a bit of a socialist there. He wants to divide the money around the people of the kingdom. So maybe some of you, like me, have spent some time during this pandemic thinking of people that you loved who've left this world. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about my father. So my father was born in 1933 in Poland, came to America in 1948. He had a tough childhood. He spent his professional life as a rabbi, mostly serving a community in Mahopac, New York. And it was not always so comfortable for me growing up there, the son of a rabbi in a relatively small town, the only family that really kept kosher and observed Shabbat. And I imagine it would have been much easier for my father to live and work in a community of like-minded people who came to shul every Shabbat morning with diligence. But that's not what he chose. And I wonder if there is some connection. I've often wondered if there's a connection between his war-torn childhood and his willingness to serve the community in the way that he did. His ability to connect to and sacrifice for the community may be itself an outgrowth of his appreciation for the idea of community that he might have gained during World War II. And when he grew old and we moved to Teaneck, my wife and I and family, he would walk to shul with me. And our shul is not far from our house, but there is one short, steep hill. And that hill, short and steep as it is, grew increasingly difficult for him to navigate as he got older. And our walk was slow. I remember, to my embarrassment, I channeled the anxiety and sadness and fear that I felt watching him age at this moment of walking up the hill to shul, watching him become more fragile before my eyes. And I channeled that into anxiety and sadness and fear and ultimately impatience. And looking back, I now know what that moment represents. My father slowly making his way up that hill represents a commitment to community even in the face of fragility and loss. And we are now at a turning point when our communities are deciding to reopen after months of relative closure. We lost something, albeit temporarily. And that loss was a reminder of the importance of community to us. And maybe for some of us, for me, of our failure in realizing the importance of community and how we acted. Hopefully we learned something and reevaluated and paid attention. We delivered meals and made phone calls and dreamed of a time when we could relate to our communities the same but different, with a renewed sense of appreciation and commitment and responsibility. Like King Lear, in terms of how we thought about our community, we changed through loss, or at least I hope we did. And that's the first thing King Lear drew my attention to. Our shared responsibility for our community, recognized at a time of deep communal fragility. So, the tragedy of King Lear is about who he was as a citizen, as a king, but it is also about who he was as a father. And I mentioned how angry he became at his daughter Cordelia when she refused to express her love in terms suitable to Lear's massive ego, how he banished her. And you don't have to feel too sorry for her. When you're the daughter of a king and you're banished, it means you go and you marry the king of France. So she was doing okay. But he did banish her. And ultimately, in his other daughters turn on him, Cordelia returns to England with her husband's French army and tries to restore her father to the throne. But she and her father, King Lear, are captured by the other daughters and imprisoned. And I want to read this passage from Lear, what he says to his daughter Cordelia as they are hauled away to prison, having realized the error of his ways. And it is also on your source sheet. It says, Part 2, family. No, 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 no. Come, let's away to prison. We two alone will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. So we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies and hear poor rogues talk of court news. And we'll talk with them too, who loses and who wins, who's in and who's out, and take upon us the mystery of things as if we were God's spies. And we'll wear out in a walled prison packs and sects of great ones that ebb and flow by the moon. This has always been one of my favorite passages in this play, and really in any of the Shakespearean plays that I'm familiar with. And this is Lear's Viktor Frankl moment. We can be imprisoned, and yet there is a freedom left to us. Like two birds in the cage, like families trapped in their homes. Because Lear isn't actually alone, he can still sing. He is in this emotional space now where he realizes how much he loves his daughter. And that love is actually sufficient for him to turn his prison into a place of song. In this cage, they will observe the silly world of court intrigue that used to be so important to him when he was that vain, narcissistic king. And together they will take upon us the mystery of things. They will think about the great mysteries of the world. And life Like God's spies. It's such a rich image, God's spies. It's judgmental, but it's rich in spirituality and acceptance. And how far can we push this, right? We can really push this. Is the whole world, in a sense, this cage? Are we all birds helpless and trapped and imprisoned? And there is still song and appreciation and gratitude like there is for Lear in that moment, because we are not alone in this world. We're with the people we love most. That's what Lear, in the moments before he dies, learns. And I think that's what many of us, in our finer moments, the moments that maybe we're most proud of during these last few months, in between maybe longer stretches of frayed nerves and pessimism, maybe, on Shabbos making kiddush or playing a game or sitting on the porch, moments when we recognize what Lear recognized, that being trapped with the people we love can be a kind of blessing and not just a curse. And here too, I want to reflect on my father. So I have 3 kids, and we were living in Teaneck when my son, probably 4 or 5 years old, was learning to read. And maybe like some of you, you experienced the miracle of watching your children learn to read. And maybe like me, you found yourself sometimes maybe not appreciating that miracle fully, a little bit bored or impatient as they sounded out word after word. And that repetition and slowness making it a little tough to stay in touch with the miracle. Shout out to all the early childhood educators and their infinite miraculous patience. So my father used to accompany my son upstairs at bedtime to read. And instead of reading to my son, he would sit on the side of my son's bed and watch my son read aloud. And I can still picture him so clearly listening to my son read, listening to him sound out the words, his smiling, his eyes closed, just relishing that one-on-one time. Never bored, never impatient. Willing to listen as long as my son was willing to read, or until my wife or I said, that's it, lights out. And that to me is family, that image, that sort of patience and appreciation. I wonder if it emerges most naturally when we're feeling fragile, if we can control our fear long enough to recognize what blessings we have and the blessing of not being alone in this world. And I want to compare Lear for a moment to another king from Shakespeare, King Claudius from Hamlet. King Claudius, if you remember, murders Hamlet's father, marries Hamlet's mother, steals the throne. He's not a good man, but he has a remarkable moment. He's sort of the antithesis of the caricature, the Disney caricature of a villain. He has this remarkable moment that we get to eavesdrop on, where he's praying to God and wondering if he can ever be forgiven by God for his sins. And you have this whole source on your source sheet, but I'm just going to read the last few lines, which I've bolded you. At the end of this back and forth, can I be forgiven? Can I not be forgiven? He says, O wretched state, O bosom black as death, O limed soul, that struggling to be free art more engaged. Help, angels, make essay, bow stubborn knees, and heart with strings of steel, be soft as sinews of the newborn babe, all may be well. It's an amazing speech. And you have to know what this lime reference is to get why it's so relevant to King Lear. Small birds were caught by coating branches in lime. And the more they struggled to free themselves from this lime, the more stuck they became. It's like the glue traps that maybe some of you have at some point in your life used to catch mice. And it's such a contrast between these two kings, both comparing themselves to trapped birds. Lear, powerless and imprisoned, but because he's together with his beloved daughter, he's able to sing, turn his back on previous ways of relating to people, embrace a loving commitment to his family. Claudius is trapped by his own unwillingness or inability to change. Soon enough, he's going to literally want to kill Hamlet. So he's the bird in lime. The more he struggles, the more trapped he is. Lear's transformative moment suggests a way of relating to this imprisonment in which we find ourselves. Are we trapped like birds in lime, like Claudius? Sort of awaiting our doom alone and thereby struggling in vain to free ourselves, wasting our remaining time struggling against this prison? Or are we like Lear, still trapped, still with precious little time remaining, in fact, less time than Claudius? But precisely because he's with Cordelia, he's able to sing with gratitude and a sense of wonder. And I know that many people are alone at this time. Not everyone has the blessing that I have of a family that I live with. And maybe that in turn can be an inspiration to me to reach out to those people, to channel the blessing that I can recognize toward an act of reaching out, an invitation to someone else to join us in our cage, figuratively speaking. Last part. And this is where things get a little more complicated. So complicated, I was tempted to dump this whole part. I wasn't sure I could find my way through it. But maybe like some of you during these months, I found myself drawn to the outdoors so powerfully that I really didn't want to skip it. Finding solace and sometimes peace watching birds in my backyard or walking down by the Hackensack River down the street from where I live. And if these ruminations are about the aspects of life to which my attention was drawn in the last few months, then I really feel and I want to spend some time discussing King Lear's complicated depiction of nature. Birds and rivers are part of the natural world, but viruses are part of the natural world too. Nature's complicated. And the play has a very specific understanding of the relationship of nature to society. In King Lear, nature is lawless. And society offers a framework within which nature's terrifying realities can be structured and at least in part tamed. So let's look first at the character of Edmund, the bastard son of Gloucester. I haven't mentioned him yet. Gloucester is a duke. He's one of the few characters who remains loyal to King Lear. He has two sons, one of whom is an illegitimate bastard. The illegitimate bastard, Edmund, is determined to inherit his father's lands and title, even though the laws of the time would have prevented him from inheriting them because of his illegitimate birth. He favors, as he says, in this sense, nature. He sees himself as by nature equal to his legitimate brother, Edgar, prevented from inheriting his deserved wealth by a few arbitrary points of custom, social mores that he's willing to ignore. And what does he say about this? So let's again go back to our source sheet. This is excerpted from King Lear, Act 1, Scene 2. It's one of my favorite speeches in Lear. My students often make fun of me because I say, every time I come to a line I say, this is my favorite line in all of King Lear. And I really do mean it, even though I totally contradict myself. Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom, and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me? For that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother. Why bastard? Wherefore base? When my dimensions are as well compact, my mind is generous, my shape is true, as honest madam's issue. Why brand they us with base, with baseness, bastardy, base, base? Who in the lusty stealth of nature take more composition and fierce quality than doth within a dull, stale, tired bed go to the creating of a whole tribe of fops, got tween sleep and wake? Well then, legitimate Edgar, I must have your land. Our father's love to the bastard Edmund, as to legitimate, fine word legitimate, well, my legitimate. If this letter speed and my invention thrive, Edmund the base shall top the legitimate. I grow, I prosper, now gods, stand up for bastards. It's a great final line. There's a yearbook quote. Now gods, stand up for bastards. And the distinction between nature and what society deems as natural is underlined by Edmund's rejection of the natural ties of children to their father in favor of the laws of nature. In Shakespeare, the respect due to parents is often described as an aspect of nature. That word, nature, is often a kind of trope for filial loyalty and respect. Edmund rejects that notion as custom, as social pretense. He says there is no reason why he can't inherit the land just because he's a few months younger and just because he's a bastard. And then he inverts the logic. He's actually like pretty clever. He says, I was the child, I was born out of wedlock. I was the child of a passionate loss of control. My brother was the child of a bored, stale marital bed. So of course, that the passion from whence I sprang, I'm therefore the superior son. Now God, stand up for bastards. The nature to which Edmund appeals here is animal law, where appetite is the driving force behind action. And Edmund's behavior comes from his urge to satisfy his appetite for his brother's legitimacy and gain the property and status. This is summarized later by the Duke of Albany's sentiment that humanity must perforce prey on itself like monsters of the deep. By nature, we are cruel and selfish, and society and custom channels these aggressive impulses. While other characters like to pretend the respect between family members is natural, Edmund recognizes this as pretense. He knows we have a choice. We can tame our natures with social structures and customs, or we can give into nature and ourselves be animals, driven by our appetites. The play actually offers countless references to animals. Lear's daughters are repeatedly referred to as different kinds of animals. So there's two relationships to nature on the surface presented here. A contentious relationship where we struggle against nature, try to impose our will on it, sometimes fail, but always struggle, like Lear in the storm. And his speech at this moment is so famous, his contest with the storm. It's on your source sheet, but we're going to skip it now for the sake of time. Or we can embrace an impression of nature that is violent and animalistic, in which social structures are meaningless and ethics are an invention. So I've mentioned already, this play brought me to thinking about the relationship we have with nature. A virus brings society to a halt. Viruses are part of nature, insidious and threatening, but like many of you, perhaps, I found myself spending a lot of time in my backyard really appreciating nature, listening to the birds. And my wife and I have joked about animals taking over Teaneck. You know, now that the traffic has diminished these last few months, we've seen foxes and a deer and even a turkey walking down the street in front of our house. So despite the virus's assault on so many people, the idea that we're engaged in an ongoing battle with nature, that's just not what I felt. And the most obvious options in Lear, that we are victims of nature or that we can fight against it, neither felt exactly right. So I want to get back to that concluding speech, like birds in a cage singing. That resonated for me. What are these birds looking at in that speech? They laugh at gilded butterflies. Certainly this is a reference to the brightly colored courtiers that swarm the court that Lear has learned was so petty and empty. They're despicable in their shallowness. But taken a different way, the image, I think, can mean something else. Birds marveling at butterflies. We are limited by nature. Nature assaults us. Our very mortality is the ultimate cage in which we live. But there is yet a kind of celebration and appreciation possible. Birds in the cage laughing at gilded butterflies. Sitting in my backyard watching the birds like I've never watched the birds. Almost like being trapped has allowed me, or forced me maybe, to pay attention to the natural world in a way I never did. Lear first struggles against the storm, but eventually he adopts and embraces the role of witness. Lacking control, observing, not quite participating, he finds himself laughing at butterflies with an almost childlike wonder at the mystery that is the natural world. So one last story of my dad. When we first bought our house and we brought my mother and father to the house to show it to them, I remember him standing in the street looking up and down at the trees that lined our street and saying, and sort of sighing as he said it, "This is paradise." Now, I live on a nice street. I like my street. The trees are pretty nice. I'm proud of my street. I'm grateful for it. But I don't know that I would call it paradise. And I remember also how much he loved sitting in my backyard. He would always bring a book or a section of the New York Times with him when he went out to the backyard, but he never ended up reading it. He always ended up watching the birds, and this was not during a pandemic. And I think that there are moments in life when we find ourselves paying closer attention than usual to the details of the natural world, to the tree-lined streets and the backyard birds of Bergen County. And they suddenly seem less ordinary and more perfect than they did before. It's maybe a perspective that's always available to us, but it is one that I am more inclined to adopt as life becomes more fraught, as it seems shorter. There's a famous story, and I don't know if it's true. I don't think anybody knows if it's true, told of William Blake, the great painter-poet, that in his old age, he was visited by a small child, and he put his hand on her head, and he offered her the following bracha. "May God make the world as beautiful to you, my child, as it has been to me." And while we don't know if it's true, from the poet who wrote in Auguries of Innocence the following lines, it rings true. He wrote, "To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." It rings true. And this, I think, is what King Lear has offered me in these last few months, a way of expanding my perspective by focusing on the small during a period of great confinement and restriction and isolation. So it must be possible to feel two feelings at once, like King Lear does. The feeling that, as the play concludes, this is a sad time, the weight of which we must obey, during which those with best meaning have incurred the worst, even while we embrace the new perspective these unusual experiences have afforded us, recognizing that every crisis is an opportunity, and that even imprisoned in our cages, we can still sing with a kind of honest, if complicated, joy. So that's all I have. I had a hard time juggling between the chat box and my notes. So I don't know if I missed a question there. But that's what I have to share with you tonight. So thank you for being here. I hope some of you will be inspired to read or reread King Lear, which is a really great play.